Are these on too? Yes. Good morning, everybody. Hoş geldiniz, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of those who value Turkish culture and society, I want to commend Ambassador Feridun Sinirlioğlu and Professor Asher Susser for their vision in choosing this most important topic. It is my privilege today to introduce one of Turkey's leading intellectuals, Professor Hasan Bülent Karaman, who will deliver the keynote address. Before I do so, I'd like to say a few words from my own perspective about Turkish culture and society. It is my belief that the founder of modern Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, understood the transformational power of culture. He is said to have noted that had he not been head of state, he would have chosen to be the Minister of Culture. As a result of the reforms he introduced, Turkey experienced a period of rapid modernization throughout much of the last century. The choices he made for his society in the 1920s and 1930s enabled the Turkish people to progress with great rapidity towards a contemporary way of life. As we look at other societies today, struggling with transformational issues, the success of Turkey behooves us to take a look once again at the reforms. The use of the vernacular language, the absolute equality for women, and the separation of politics from religion. Americans have always felt very close to Turkey, and that's certainly true of my own family. The reasons usually given date back to military and security cooperation that began following World War II. However, the ties that bind are far deeper. These ties have survived despite the occasional disagreement because they are based on shared cultural values. One of the first diplomatic missions opened by the United States was in Izmir, Turkey, in the early 19th century. There were many American schools in Turkey, also dating back to the 19th century. The exchange of ideas and knowledge between our two countries is far older than the security cooperation, important though that may be. My young son once asked me, if Ataturk is the father of Turkey, who is the mother? Good question. Without missing a beat, I named Halide Edip Adivar, the Turkish writer and intellectual who was a friend and advisor of Ataturk's. She was the first young Muslim woman to graduate from the American school in Istanbul shortly after the turn of the last century. Her contribution to the intellectual life of her society is an example of the importance of educational and cultural exchange, and you'll hear more about her during the session on the Turkish novel. Turkey has come a very long way since the time of Ataturk. It has had enormous network of public and private universities, world-class media outlets, and a thriving economy. The people are industrious and increasingly better educated. Its intellectual life is thriving, as illustrated by the presence with us today of one of Turkey's most prominent men of letters, Professor Hasan Bülent Karaman. Professor Karaman is at present the Ahmet Ertegun Professor of Princeton, and Ahmet Ertegun, by the way, is the name of a Turkish American who's made a great contribution to our own society. The faculty and students in the Near Eastern Studies Department have benefited enormously by his participation in the intellectual life of the university. He will return this summer to his position as Professor of Political Science and Art Theory at Sabancı University in Istanbul. Aside from this year at Princeton, he has also taught at Columbia University, the University of Michigan, and both the Middle East Technical University and Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey. Professor Karaman served as the chief advisor to the Turkish Minister of Culture from 1991 to 95. He has written extensively on art and literature and has been the host of a Turkish television program dedicated to interviews with leaders in the arts. As a senior columnist for Radikal, he wrote frequently on politics and culture for Turkey's leading intellectual daily newspaper. His research interests are extensive, including political theory, contemporary art and visual theory, and Turkish political thought. A prolific author, he has produced over 10 books and countless articles on those subjects. A native of Kars, Professor Karaman received his primary education in that city. He attended secondary school in Ankara and graduated from Gazi University in engineering. He did graduate studies in economics at Hacettepe University and received his doctoral degree in political science from Bilkent University in 1989. He is a member of many of the leading Turkish intellectual organizations, including the Eczacıbaşı Istanbul Foundation of Culture and Art, the Turkish Social, Economic, and Political Research Foundation, the Social Democracy Foundation, the History Foundation, and many others too numerous to name. His most recent works are Sitting in a Glass Room, 2002, and Turkey Between Postmodernism and Modern, 2002. The title of Professor Hasan Bülent Karaman's presentation today is From Progressive Conservatism to Conservative Progressivism in Turkish Culture. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. I'm totally speechless after this introduction. I would like to start by expressing my deep gratitude to Professor Sasser, actually, for inviting me to this wonderful country where I feel myself at home, to my friend Amy Singer, and of course to Ambassador Sinirlioğlu for his very warm welcome. And I think I'm becoming more and more a protege of the Finn family, because whenever I give a speech in Princeton University, Robert is the chair, and here Helena is the chair, and of course my deep thanks go both of them. It's not an easy task to talk about the culture and society interaction in Turkey, modern Turkey. Today I'll try to make a general survey of this interaction all through the Republican period, and I'll try, of course, to speculate on some specific points of it. Culture itself is a difficult concept to tackle with, and it is defined anew at different ages, and today it's once again charged with new meanings, because the world is passing through, or has been passing through, a new period since the end of the Cold War, since 1989. On one level, one could say that culture has no meaning at all left anymore, or at another level, one could say that it has such a loaded meaning and content that it can only be compared to the meaning that it has once gained during the German Romanticist era. At a time when the Berlin Wall was erected, Cold War was at its peak, and the world was divided into two parts as East and West. Culture was one of the elements over which the nations or blocs were competing. We don't have that meaning of culture anymore. Even in that time, people were divided, societies were dividing their fellow citizens into two groups as the cultured and the non-cultured. It's certain that that model doesn't exist anymore. Feminist studies, post-colonial studies, subaltern studies completely changed the nature, meaning, and the function of the culture, as well as its social capacity. Today, it is believed that that culture covers the mythology of the white colonial man, and it is mainly Eurocentric, whereas now we have the proliferation of different cultures walking into the stage. However, the textbooks today started to be rewritten in the course of multiculturalism, mainly, feminism, and in the course of pluralism, considering the importance and the constructive power of the notion of the other. So this emphasis put on the notion of the other clearly constructed a new understanding and a new meaning of culture. We don't have anymore the Humboldtian type of gymnasium model after having produced its last prestigious names as Nietzsche and Freud. The strange point, or the interesting point, is that these two names were the graduates of the same gymnasium. Both were fluent in ancient Greek and Latin and everything, and both are considered now as the discontents of modernity. This point itself even shows something very controversial. There is only one reason for this new situation, which I call sometimes the void of culture. This void is created by the high culture, by the loss of the high culture, and it is now filled by the popular culture. The language written and spoken in the cellular phones, the language used for the chats, created a new medium, which is, of course, completely different than we used to have. What I call the trap of the new Bermuda Triangle, football, fado, and fiesta, is reigning all over the world. On the other hand, I would say that this new structure of culture stands upon what I call the micro-sociologies. And this notion and the culture gains its meaning through mainly the politics of identity, the politics of difference, and the politics of recognition. The new concepts that we have been developing since 1980s, such as multiculturalism, pluralism, cosmopolitanism, transgression, space, fragmentation, deterritorialization, the ever-increasing importance of the communitarian politics, birth of the new subgroups, makes culture one of the most important elements of the sociopolitics these days, even though we don't have, even though we don't have the old forms and the models of culture. Modern Turkey has passed and is still passing through these phases as well. The history of modern culture, that is usually started in the year 1923, has transformed enormously in the last 10, 15 years. The year 1990s might be taken as the turning point for this transformation in Turkey. And in that sense, I would make a point and say that usually it is believed that Turkey is completely cut off from the rest of the world, and it takes ages and ages, sometimes centuries, to get into a kind of reconciliation with the West, or let's say the rest of the world. This is not true. I believe this was not true in the past, and this is not true today. So what happened in the rest of the world in the 80s is happening in Turkey these days, or in the last, let's say, 10 years. Now I want to analyze the dynamics of this development, first by proposing a periodization. I suggest that the post-1923 culture in Turkey, which is called the modern culture and the modern society, can be analyzed in three different periods: 1923 to 1950, 1950 to 1980, and from 1980 to present. And now I want to look at the specific points of these periods, and let me start by the 1923 to 1950 period, which I usually refer as the period of construction. History, if the history is continuity in time, it's quite possible to start the cultural history of the Republic referring to the time known as the Second Constitutional Era that begins in 1908 and controlled by the Young Turks. In that sense, I would say that the Kemalist period of the 1923 to 1950 was a kind of continuation of the Young Turk period. And it's usually believed that, or argued that, the 1923 is a new start. Of course, it's a new start in the sense that I'm going to try to delineate here. But I also believe that it is the end of a long process that started in the year 1839. So 1923 was the start of the end of a long process of transformation, westernization, and modernization. The most significant point of this period is, of course, the westernization, and in that sense I argue that westernization of the period might be divided into two components: the internal westernization as well as the external westernization. Of course, these two were complementary to each other, but internal westernization provisions an epistemological and ideological transformation, a transformation of the mentality, whereas the latter encompasses the visual transformation, the transformation of the dress codes, of the metric system, the calendar system, so on and so forth. I call this as the external westernization. And nationalism is the main bridge in the Kemalist period connecting these two categories into each other. And it's usually argued that the Kemalist period was more for a kind of internal westernization, and this was, of course, after the ideas or the model constructed by the eminent Turkish philosopher or sociologist, mainly Ziya Gökalp. Gökalp himself was arguing that culture is national, local, parochial, whereas civilization is international, and it depends mainly on the notion of the technology. So Turkey could import, if I may say, the technology and the civilization from the West, but even in the Kemalist period, with an emphasis, it was argued that the culture would be internally and nationally produced. Gökalp's ideas and their roots, as well as the mentality of the Kemalist period, might be found in the German Romanticism, with an emphasis on Herder's thought, and of course in the context of the Durkheimian sociology. The famous differentiation between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, the state-society differentiation or distinction made by Tönnies, was once again, or has always been, the crux of this formulation, opening to the, what I say, the internal conflicts of the period. And I just want to concentrate on these internal conflicts. On the one hand, Cumhuriyet, the Republic, wants to create a new identity of citizenship based on the answer given to the question, what is enlightenment, by the German philosopher Kant. Kant was, in his famous article, arguing that the enlightened individual is nothing but the individual emancipated from self-incurred tutelage and one who cares or one who dares to know. And he uses the Latin word saper aude for this. The main aim of republic is the creation of the citizen who dares to know and who has completely emancipated from the self-incurred tutelage or controls over him. But on the other hand, the same Republican ideology, due to many reasons, argues that the same citizen should be controlled by the strong centralized state. This, I believe, is the main internal paradox and the conflict of the Republican ideology. This internal paradox can be seen at different levels. On the one hand, the Republic wants to create a rationalism or a rational society based on the Weberian idea of the rational bureaucracy. But on the other hand, as I just a minute ago, the Tönnies differentiation between the state and society, the Republic wants to create a communitarian politics, a society of solidarity and a corporatist state and society togetherness. So these internal paradoxes, one, or I would say that, is an outcome of the quick or fast or abrupt westernization that has started with the 1923 model. And in that sense, one could argue that the new Turkey, the Republican Turkey, is a conflict of the modernity and the culture, whereas the modernity was foreseeing a kind of transformation of the society, or let's say the transformation of the individual. The culture was provisioning the control of the individual by the state or by the community itself. So the main internal paradox is again between the state and the society, or between sometimes the society and the individual. The second, of course, there are some points which needs further elaboration and emphasis. The attachment to the notion of neoclassicism, for example, of the Kemalist period, which has usually been omitted a lot, is one of the most important aspects or the peculiarities of the Republican era. The great process of translation that started in the 1940s is again a devotion to the idea that Western modernity is a child of French Enlightenment, the Renaissance thought, and the Greek civilization of the 5th century BC, which continues to the 8th century BC. So the works of these cultures would be translated into Turkish during 1940s. Even after, in the early Republic, one of the basic arguments was that Kemal Atatürk took the revenge of the Trojans in Sakarya. This idea or this argument in time developed into another movement in the cultural field in Turkey, known as the Blue Anatolia model, which argued that all civilizations of Anatolia is mixed and merged with the Turkish culture again that has been found or established in Anatolia. The second period, but before the second period, let me add this one. The most important aspect of the first period is the importance, the central importance of the state, of an extremely centralized project of modernization, which usually referred as the top-down modernization in the relevant literature. The second period starts in the year 1950 after the general elections, and following the elections, the constitutive party of the Kemalist period, Republican People's Party, is replaced by the Democrat Party. If Republican People's Party signifies the center, the Democrat Party, who walked into power in the year 1950, clearly denotes what is known as the periphery. Periphery is a loose term which usually goes to the provincial Turkey, and of course the new party and the new politics goes more for a kind of populist ideology. And instead of an elitist, authoritarian, central politics, now there is a populist, provincial, peripheral culture and politics reigning in Turkey between the years 1950 to 1980. And there is one significant, again, concept in this period, that is the emphasis put on the notion of democracy. In that sense, I would argue that Turkish modernization is a kind of modernization excluding democracy. That's another question. Would that be possible to modernize Turkey in the context of, or together with the new notion of democracy? That's another question, which I don't want to go deep into the discussion right now. But the new period's emphasis was, of course, on the democracy. And democracy came, of course, with a kind of compromise, the concept used most. Then, eventually, for example, started or let the prayer to be said in Arabic once again. There was a ban, and the prayer was said in Turkish in the Kemalist period. And the democracy, the notion of democracy that flourished in Turkey in the year 1950 was very much concomitant with the notion of religion. And in that sense, I would say that the Kemalist period is very much like the sheer secularism of the French Enlightenment, whereas the new period brought two new concepts to fore. The first one is, of course, the peasantry and Islam. Peasantry was something related with the sociological modernization of the society in the post-1950 period, and Islam was more convoluted with the notion of the cultural modernization of the post-1950 period. And this, of course, brought once again the main clash between the secularist groups and the more religious or Islamist groups in Turkey, which is still continuing today. In the post-1950 period, one could see in the 1970s the birth of the Marxist politics and the Marxist understanding of the culture. Of course, this is today far away from its 1970 understanding, but the notion of the left, the birth of the new class of intellectuals, which were more inclined to the left politics, was again a new chapter in the period of democratization in the post-1950 period. The last phase of the cultural transformation in Turkey happens to be in the 1980s, and this stream is yet a flowing current. There is, I would say, a radical difference between the post and the pre-1980 cultural movements in Turkey, and this once again emanates from the changing positions of the state and society. So the main, I would say, modernization concept in Turkey is the clash between the state and the society, and the configuration and the reconfiguration of the state and society. Of course, until 1980s in Turkey, there was and there has always been an overwhelmingly strong state determining the cultural milieu. But the new understanding of the culture, which is more a bottom-up model of culture, also came to fore in Turkey in the post-1980 period. And this is more an outcome of the emphasis put for the first time in Turkey on the notion of liberalism, both on the economic, both in the economic and the sociological senses. Before, it was more a matter of democratization, but in the post-1980 era, it is more than democracy. It is the liberalism or the liberalization of the economy and the state-society interaction. That's also a continuing process today in Turkey, creating sometimes called the asymmetries of memory. Liberty has always been a constitutive agent of the Turkish modernity. All groups, from young Ottomans to young Turks, from republicans to the supporters of the idea of national sovereignty, all have spoken with reference to freedom, liberalization, and emancipation. But, of course, the contents of these concepts creates all the time a changing and always a new state-society relation. The significant characteristic of the post-19 period in the post-1980 period is, of course, the birth of the popular culture. And this is sometimes called as the emancipation of the culture and the modernization itself. But I argue that popular culture should be analyzed more, and it goes not for the emancipation, because first of all, it is the indoctrination of the masses with a culture produced by the culture industry. So I don't see a sort of Enlightenment type emancipation with the birth of the or the reigning of the popular culture. And the logic of the mass culture is, I believe, the end of the critical and the analytical mind. And there's, I mean, in that sense, the popular culture is a kind of external power over the masses and over the society. So, state on the cultural level now is replaced by the mass culture producing cultural or let's say industry of culture. But eventually I find in the post-1980 period a kind of paradigm shift, and I call this the distanciation from the normative cultural structure in Turkey. This new culture gains its full meaning in the form of three main dynamics of the present-day Turkish culture. The first is the squeezed position of the individual and the social mind between East and West. No one can further be pressed to choose any one of these components. Turkey is now very well aware that it is the East on the West and vice versa. The notion of civilization crisis, medeniyet buhranı, once argued and analyzed by the writers like Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, Abdullah Şinasi Hisar, Attila İlhan, or even Oğuz Atay from the younger generation, are, I believe, tarnished in this sense, and there is no more this distinction between the Eastern and the Western cultures. Second, Turkey doesn't perceive and comprehend modernity anymore as a matter or practice of the West. After the development of such notions as of Western modernities, alternative modernities, interpenetrations or transgressions, politics of space, Turkey has eventually learned that there cannot be a unique, single one modernity, and consequently has got into terms with its own values, on which I will elaborate more in a few minutes. The coexistence of values like urban, suburban, modern, feudal, Eastern, Western, Islamic, non-Islamic, or secular and Islamic is now considered as true structural elements of an ordinary Turk and of the present-day Turkey society and culture interaction. This means this togetherness of different and once clashing concepts creates today a new cultural discourse and practice based on what I call the kitsch. So the kitsch culture, first of all, emanates from this togetherness of different and clashing components. Turkey, this is the third point, doesn't anymore esteem the reminiscence of the past cultural values. There is a political political party in Turkey in power who says it's a conservative one, but still I argue that there is no more remembrance of the time past in Turkey anymore. Once there were two groups in Turkey, one arguing that the past culture is the main culture of Turkey, but we didn't know what this past culture is. Was that Islamic or Ottoman or Seljukian. However, there was this loose notion of, excuse me, the past. And of course, the groups adhering to the notion of the modern and the modernity. Now, one of the groups has freed itself from the rage of effacing the past culture. These were the modernists. And while the other doesn't mourn anymore for the loss of it. So this is something I believe extremely new in Turkey. Under these circumstances, I argue that today's culture is dominantly developed on the politics of space, and it is vastly geographical in all senses of the meaning, rather than being based on the politics of time and the history or politics of, if I may say, the historical. This proves that the continuity in the Turkish culture is more determining than it is assumed, although it is believed to be the reverse. The modern Turkish culture is the continuation of the three main streams. The stream that started in 1839 and continued with Republic is continuing today. The second stream that started in the year 1950 is continuing today, as well as the stream started in the post-1980 is, of course, continuing today. So, to put in Derrida's famous dictum, it is not a matter of difference, but what matters is differ in the Turkish culture in this sense. And I want to conclude my presentation by making three points. The modern Turkish culture, the first one is a matter of, I say, identity creation or construction. The long, and I don't know, maybe the short history of this process yields to the transformation of that significant identity created, constructed by the Republicans, by the moderns, or by the conservatives. From the identity created and defined by the state, now we moved to a new identity creating and defining the state. This is something really I find important in the modern Turkey. Second, modern Turkish culture is a matter of modernity in the European sense at the beginning. But now it's more a new model of modernity based on the notion of the alternative modernities. In that sense, Turkey argues that whatever it has is a component of the modernization of Turkey. And again, in this framework, I would say that once the modernization of Turkey was foreseeing or using a kind of self-orientalizing manner. This is all over also in the post-1980 period. And Turkey is now trying to implement itself in the West, attaching to the assumption that there is nothing such as cultural modernity, believing that this notion has Eurocentric connotations. Rather, it is arguing that modernization is a matter of democratization. democratization. And if there is a culture of Europe, if there is a European culture, then it should first and foremost be a culture of democracy. Third, the dominant popular culture in Turkey is an eclectic one, including significantly the provincial sentiments, and Islam is a strong component of it. Today's problem is whether Turkey will keep Islam, or, if I may say, tackle or deal with Islam as a cultural component, or will be using Islam as a political matter. And this, I believe, will create these three components, will create the next period of culture in Turkey. I hope we will be speaking 10 years after now. Thank you very much for your interest.
So, thank you very much, Professor Karaman. That was quite fascinating and very thought-provoking. If I may take the prerogative of asking the first question, you outlined these three phases, and certainly you described to us a process of transformation, and then you said that all of these things came together, although we do see today in Turkey rifts between those who are caught in one or another of these different categories. In other words, caught in period 1, caught in period 2, and or living only in period 3 without having absorbed the two earlier ones. And I think what's very fascinating, certainly as someone who first came to Turkey in the late 60s and went back in the 70s and 80s, I saw this evolution. And, you know, I came in sort of at the tail end of phase 1, as you describe it, although there are many people there for whom that continues to be the predominant element, as there are many people for whom the second phase has become the predominant element. My question is whether or not you see a point in the future, I mean, given the complexity of identity anywhere in the world today because of globalization and all these other factors, do you see a point in the future when there will once again be a kind of broader consensus about for all citizens of Turkey, you know, about what it means to be Turkish, that somehow encompasses all of this? Do you see, I mean, right now it seems that there are people in different sectors, but do you see a kind of coming together?
Well, that's a great question, because that is, I think, the gist of my analysis concerning the social and the cultural Turkey, because I believe there will be the togetherness of different groups and components in Turkey, because once we were dividing the Turkish, we were analyzing the Turkish society in the context of center-periphery differentiation or distinction. Whereas I now argue that due to this enormous politics of immigration, I would say, from the rural area to from the suburban area to the metropolitan areas, will bring a new cultural and sociological structure in Turkey. And instead of talking about the distinct two different components like center and periphery, now we have more and more a periphery in the center, or what I call the central periphery. And this, of course, brings a kind of reconciliation between the different, let's say, belief systems of the groups. And I also believe that what is now referred as the secular Islamic clash in Turkey is more a clash of these two, the cultural clash of these two groups. And of course there will be a third way which will bringing these two different groups into terms with each other. So I believe this is and of course sociological problem, first of all. And if Turkey can continue with a higher level of sociological modernization and economic modernization in Turkey, I believe this cultural problem will be a more easier one to solve.
Thank you. Thank you. Questions from the audience? Yes, Professor Singer.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I wonder, it seems to me that there's an interesting tension that runs through the talk. On the one hand, you lay out a periodization which is completely political. You've divided it 1923, 1950, and 1980, and those are all, I think for the most part, definitely defined by major political changes in Turkey. On the other hand, because you in fact start in 1839 and talk about the effects of what we know to be an extended reform period of reform and change, which was in fact much broader than merely political. It seems to me that, or my question to you would be, can you set aside those three political moments and talk about other defining changes or figures or trends in the shaping of Turkish culture? That is it necessary to privilege the political to such an extent, or are there other ways of parsing out the 20th century in Turkey? And just as a coda, do you think that that is still true? That is, given the shifts in the 1980s, given the real force of popular culture and other kinds of cultural movements inside Turkey, minority movements, which we haven't really talked about, but also minority identity movements, do you think that the political will continue to be the determining factor in cultural change?
Well, that's my intellectual choice. I would say that political will always determine the cultural. But let me put it this way. I say that, or I think, more up until 1980s, political was the main component of the cultural and sociological transformation. But in the post-1980 period, the notion of both the modernity, the transformation, and the politics has changed a lot. Now, in the pre-1980 period, all over the world, this was a kind of flow from politics to culture. And in the post-1980 period, it's a flow from culture to politics. But whenever I say culture, I'm not isolating it, and I'm not talking about an abstract notion of culture. I was talking, I just mentioned in my presentation the notion of the feminist politics, for example, or the politics of identity. What's politics of identity? It is on the one hand a cultural notion, and it's on the other hand a political notion. And now I argue that instead of going from a notion of politics written with a kind of capital P, now we're more and more talking about the micro-political processes, which is a term, of course, first or mostly used by the French philosopher Foucault. And this micro-politics is more a cultural notion in itself. And that's why I believe that there will always be a togetherness of culture and politics. However, the notion of politics and the notion of has changed more. That's why I said in my presentation the importance of culture today can only be compared to the notion of, or the importance of, or the role culture played in the German Romanticist era. And even in that time, the politics of identity in the context of nationalism was both a cultural and a political subject. And today, I believe what we call the cultural is essentially political, and it's also the other way around. So this is the change, first and foremost, the change of the concepts themselves. But there will always be togetherness, and I say now there will be a kind of flow from the cultural politics to the political politics, if I may say. Thank you.
Could we maybe look at this a little differently? You were talking earlier about the conflict between modernity and culture and the quick transformation that took place after the 20s. And it struck me that another way of looking at it is to say that, in fact, you had excuse me, two strands going on at the same time. You had the modernization of Turkey that began in 1839 and actually with the translations began much later, 1861 and afterwards, and it was mostly the translation of 18th century French works in the initial period and 19th century works only later. So you had this encapsulated westernization of the ideas of the French and, as you pointed out to me, American revolutions that was developing in Turkey. You had that one level of consciousness. And then, with the work of Gürkal and Ataturk's revolution, you had the introduction of a second layer that was very much contemporary and took its inspiration from the centralist regimes that were popular throughout the world at that time, in Germany, in Italy, in Greece, and in the Soviet Union. And there's not enough work done on the ties between Ataturk's early republic and the Soviet Union. And they were models for this centralizing force that you spoke about. And then later, when you're talking about the three periods of westernization, first I would take exception with the term westernization because although most people use it that way, that was exactly what Ataturk did not say. He spoke about contemporary civilization, and I agree with your determination, the internalizing of it, the failure of the Ottomans to adapt the thought structures of the West was what he considered to be the reason for the final collapse of the empire. And the externalization, again, modeled on the westernization, the modernization that was taking place in all of these similar countries. The peasantry of Greece and Italy and Germany were, Austria-Hungary, they were all very similar to the Ottoman Empire in its final stages. So this was a universal process that was going on. And then when you get to the quiche culture of the modern world, I would say that this, in fact, is the sad iteration of what contemporary civilization was that he was aiming for. Not the glittering ideal that everyone hoped, but in fact the world of popular culture that exists everywhere and that is universal, and it is the commercialization of life because the political structures have been left aside and are operating independently. So I just offer that to you as a different paradigm.
Robert, we will continue this conversation in Princeton.
Yeah,
Thank you. This is a great comment and contribution. But I have to write another book for that.
Are there any other questions? Anyone? Yes.
I'd like to ask a question. I'll just begin and say there are many similarities between what happened in Israel and what happened in modern Turkey in the sense of creating a new identity and a new culture that cuts itself from the past. And here I'll get to the question. The Israeli culture cuts Jews from their past in the diaspora, even Jews who lived in Israel prior to the Israeli state. And nowadays you see many Israelis going back to these cultures, picking them up again, whether it's Yiddish or Ladino or cultures from the Maghreb. My question is, do you see in any sense a return to something which is Ottoman in the culture in the sense of its pluralism that you were mentioning, in its ability to encapsulate so many identities in plural identities, not necessarily an identity or the identity in that sense, or a return to even in the sense of literacy or language?
Well, I would say yes, because this is called the Neo-Ottomanism. This is a trend that started in Turkey again in the post-1980 period. But there is again a kind of internal conflict here, and I was talking to my dear friend Mr. Bayar yesterday. There's a strange, really strange contradiction in Turkey. There's, of course, this clash of modern and ancien in Turkey as the conservatives and the moderates. But to the best of my knowledge, the modernists in Turkey in the Kemalist period, they didn't touch anything, any monument or anything left from the Ottoman period. And they went to Ankara and constructed a new town, a new city in Ankara. And of course they changed the alphabet, they changed everything to cut the memory from its past. But they didn't touch anything, excuse me, Ottoman in Istanbul or anywhere else. And they were the progressives, and that's what they called themselves. And then came in the 1950s the conservatives into power. And to my surprise, they demolished, they tore down everything left from the Ottoman, and they started to construct a new city in the center of Istanbul. And in the post-9, well, this is something very strange and unseen. Of course, in France, the architect Osman changed the whole Paris, but it was under the control of the moderns in Paris, whereas that happened in Istanbul under the control of the conservatives. That's why I say from the progressive conservatives to conservative progressives in Turkey, there's this transition. And in the post-1980 period, then started this neo-Ottomanism to get into a kind of reconciliation with the Ottoman past. And of course, this again, I believe, is a continuation or is an extension of this politics of identity. Because in the post-1989 world, by the fall of the Berlin Wall, especially in the old Soviets, everybody was rediscovering its past identity, and also that I call the identity. But in Turkey, there is also another internal conflict on the notion of this the real identity. What is the real identity in Turkey? Is it the Ottoman identity? Is it the Turkish identity? Or is it the Islamic identity? So I assume that there will be three main streams in Turkey conflicting and clashing with each other in the near future in the course of identity politics, in the course of politics of, let's say, pluralism. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I think it's time. Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Professor Susser, for organizing this. I think there's coffee. Yeah.